So I'm here with Eugenie Birch, who is the Nussdorf Professor of Urban Research and co-director of the Penn Institute for Urban Research at the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
So Jeannie, you've been involved, I know, for a number of years with the Future of Places, and more than that, you've been involved with UN Habitat and developing the new urban agenda. You were chair of the World Urban Campaign. Can you tell us a little bit about your work, both with UN Habitat and in the university?
Well, I guess I'll start with the university. I've been at the university since 1998, where I was invited to come chair the Department of City and Regional Planning. And I did that for 10 years. And then the university decided to start an institute focused on urban research. And I was asked to co-chair that with Susan Wachter at the Wharton School. So we have business and design. I'm in the School of Design, working on this particular activity. The institute is now over 10 years old. We have a number of publications. We have a series at Penn Press, The City in the 21st Century. We do a good deal of research ourselves, obviously, and we view ourselves as a convener and a voice with regard to urban research.
So can you tell us about your role with the World Urban Campaign and also the General Assembly of Partners? Maybe we'll talk about that separately.
Well, they evolved. So about 2009, I was invited to come to a meeting, and I think it was in Rio, in the World Urban Forum in Rio, at which point the World Urban Campaign was being launched, and the idea was that this would be an arm of UN Habitat to help support with the advocacy of the various activities that Habitat was involved with. Fast forward now to 2014, and the preparations for Habitat 3 were beginning. We had a wonderful first Urban Thinkers campus at Caserta in Italy, and at that campus we formulated the ideas around the city we need as an advocacy piece for UN Habitat and the World Urban Campaign. But we also realized the World Urban Campaign needed to be broadened and redefined with regard to the engagement for Habitat 3. And that was the birth of the General Assembly of Partners.
So it seems to me that this is a critical task that all of us have to somehow face, which is how to build the partnerships, how to build the partners into a kind of effective network. And I know you've been thinking that way about the General Assembly of Partners, right?
Certainly. What we did first was we realized that there were many groups that had a stake in thinking about what the new urban agenda, what would become the urban agenda, should contain. And we identified those groups, and we had 14 groups. You may or may not know that the United Nations has an official 9 major groups, and those emanate from the environmental conferences, and the nature of those groups are focused on environmental needs. Well, certainly cities have an environmental component, but they have other components as well. So we added another set of groups, 6 more groups, 7 today, 6 more groups to be part of this engagement platform. And the kinds of groups we added who hadn't been thought about in the environmental work were older persons, persons with disability, the media, parliamentarians, grassroots, and so forth. The idea was to create networks among those groups, but to create a multi-stakeholder platform where there would be discussions, intra-platform discussions about issues around which we had consensus, yet at the same time leave those individual groups to advocate for their particular needs. And the United Nations had never seen anything like this. When we announced this to the Bureau, which was the executive committee who was planning Habitat 3, the members' literally the eyes rolled. They said, "Oh, we don't think you can do that." And I mentioned I had been on the New York City Planning Commission, and I thought we could. And so we did. We spent a good deal of time organizing and discussing among ourselves as to what we thought our role would be. And we focused on the idea of partnership and the kind of things that partnerships can bring, and focused on 4 areas. The first area is knowledge. knowledge sharing and capacity building. The second area is piloting innovative ideas. The third area is monitoring, contributing to the monitoring of what would emerge from the New Urban Agenda and also the associated Agenda 2030. And lastly, advocacy. You would never stop the advocacy. That was part of the MO of what partners can do. And so as the preparations went forward for Habitat 3, we had quite an active role. You may or may not know that contrary to other conferences around Habitat, the actual documents had been produced by the agency, managed by the member states, with very little input from the stakeholders. This time around, the formation of the preparations was such that there was a good deal more input. There were 11 regional and thematic conferences. There were the policy units, which were 200 experts that created material for them. And with regard to GAP, we were involved in the drafting committees of the conferences, and we were involved, members were involved in the policy units. And then we were asked to do something along with the Global Task Force, which is the local governments group. Both of our groups were asked to hold hearings, just like a city planning hearing. The draft New Urban Agenda came out. The Global Task Force went first. They assembled, I don't know how many mayors, 40 mayors on the floor of the General Assembly in the UN, right next to the member states, who talked about what they thought was good or bad or needed to be rectified in the New Urban Agenda. The member states went back and negotiated. The next draft came out, and we at the General Assembly of Partners were invited to create a similar set of hearings and did the same thing again. So this was fairly unusual. And then when it came to Habitat 3, each stakeholder group was asked to create stakeholder roundtables to discuss next steps in terms of where implementation would go. And we were recognized for this work. We had a meeting, a private meeting. I guess we shouldn't call it a private meeting. It was an open meeting, but basically it was a meeting with the Secretary General, who was very excited that we had all come together and worked on this project. So now the job is to turn from being advocates, and let me tell you, some of our groups were pretty good at this advocacy. The older persons, watch out for them. They started out with 3 references in the New Urban Agenda and ended up with something like 27. At any rate, now it's time, the rubber is hitting the road, and it's time to think about how to implement the New Urban Agenda, and so we're now moving towards in that direction.
And the role of UN Habitat itself is changing, right? There's been an advisory group that's come in and evaluated UN Habitat's role and thought about new structures like UN cities and so on. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Certainly. As the member states were negotiating the New Urban Agenda, they quite frankly couldn't come to agreement as to exactly what this new role should be for UN Habitat. And so what they did was ask the Secretary General to appoint a panel of experts to do a study. And they were appointed, I guess, in last spring, and they spent several months and came up with a wonderful report of many recommendations about how to make UN Habitat what they called fit for purpose, the purpose of implementing the New Urban Agenda. And that report was then brought to the General Assembly, with the President of the General Assembly held a series of panels to review the report. We were asked again as part of GAP to comment on that. And then that, along with the report, was sent to what's called the second committee, which is the committee that writes the resolutions, basically. And they decided, and I think this was a very wise decision, to send some of the ideas back to Nairobi for more discussion, because the UN system itself is undergoing some reforms. And they thought it would be premature to come up with some suggestions for UN Habitat before the UN reforms had taken place. And so there's now a new schedule for thinking about how to align what will be a new structure of some sort for UN Habitat with the initiatives that the overall UN system will have. From the point of view of stakeholders and partnerships, if one reads the Secretary General's reports, the most recent one was in December, there's a very strong set of suggestions on the role of partnerships and how to manage them, and is calling for a system-wide organization of partnerships, which I think is a very good thing.
And of course, UN Habitat's resources are going to be limited, so it seems that they really are going to need this network of partners that you've been working on for so long.
Well, I just finished a paper about and it's on our website, the Penn IUR website, which traces the role of stakeholders in partnerships over time. And basically, there are a couple of points here. In 1946, when We the Peoples, which is the first sentence of the Charter of the UN, was signed, there was a provision in there for ECOSOC, which is the Economic and Social Council that's meant to carry out the second mandate, which is to advance the social and economic life of peoples. There was a provision in that saying that experts could be brought in to help the member states understand about a particular issue or to reflect public opinion. But there's always been a very, very strong line about maintaining national sovereignty in the decision-making powers of the United Nations. And that still pertains. But in the ensuing years, 70 years, big changes have occurred as to how the UN has formulated its priorities. And I would say that one of the areas that's been extremely important in helping create a revolution in this has been the environmental movement. As you know, the Stockholm first conference on the environment was held in Stockholm, and at that time the conference was member states. If they wanted to have an expert come in, they closed the official meeting. Barbara Ward was then invited to give, Barbara Ward, the economist who wrote The Only One Earth, was invited to give an hour-and-a-half lecture, but not part of the official proceedings. However, much to their surprise, 10,000 people showed up in Stockholm and started thinking, got the member states thinking about how they might start talking more systematically to the stakeholders and partners. Fast forward, I mean, there's many steps in this story, but fast forward to 2000, right after the MDGs were passed, when Kofi Annan created a panel of eminent persons to study the relationships with civil society, and the headline of their study was basically engaging with civil society is not an option, it's a necessity. How the member states would define this necessity, however, has been a little bit of a tug of war, because there's always the national sovereignty piece, but the question is how much decision-making or how much advice might occur. So what we're seeing now, obviously from 1947 to the present, is certainly stakeholders and partners have played an enormous role in defining new areas. And for our area, which is that of spatial development of cities, I think you can attribute that to the Habitat conferences. The UN never would have paid any attention to spatial development, urban form, urban design, public space without the push from the stakeholders who insisted that unless this attention was given, you would not achieve those social and economic activities. And that then gets expressed in Goal 11 of the SDGs.
Well, it seems that we've come very far to this point after many years, and I know you've been working very hard on this, and we have a long way to go perhaps, but we have a lot to work with, it seems, thanks to you and your work and the work of others.
Well, I want to thank you for your work. The Center for the Future of Places is really essential to thinking about and creating the public policy that's going to emanate from the new urban agenda. We have asked local government, regional government, and national governments to pledge the creation of public space and to create the enabling environment for doing that. But let's think about it for a second. People who are engaged in governmental work don't necessarily have the background and the experience to, number one, understand the importance of public space, and so they need to understand through the research that you're doing the value that it instills in the populations. And this value can be economic value, social value, cultural value, whatever. But the point is, we need to provide the evidence-based research to convince those national regional and local governments that it's worth investing in public space. It's one thing for a global agreement to say you should have public space, but it's another thing for this to actually happen, the creation of this public space. So we need to have the documentation of the importance of it, as I've mentioned. We also need the design research that tells us the kinds of public space that work and the kinds of public space that work with a deep contextual understanding. Public space is not a silver bullet. You can't just say, make a public space. You have to base those decisions and the design of that public space around very deep understandings of what that public space means in a particular place. Yet at the same time, the findings and the work that the center is doing shows universal principles about public space. And so the teachings that must go to localities, whether it's the citizens who are going to help plan that public space, or it's the decision makers who are going to pay for and execute that public space, you need to have this sort of interesting interface between what has worked in certain places because of basic principles about what public space is supposed to do versus and blended with what the needs are and the desires of the people who are going to be using that public space. So the work that you're doing, both in the basic research and in the piloting, it's totally in the right direction for making sure that the new urban agenda gets executed in the ways that it should.
Eugenie Birch, thank you so much for joining us.